Epstein. How did you first become friends? How did you meet?
Yeah, to some extent, a stretch to say that as it were, we were close friends. I mean, we were friends.
The unthinkable has been confirmed. Just when the world thought there was nothing more to Prince Andrew's scandal,
Prince Andrew's the king's brother, so how could this documentary impact the monarchy?
There's no doubt that Prince Andrew's friendship with Epstein still has the potential to hugely influence the reputation of the monarchy.
a shocking revelation had surfaced. Since then, rumors have been all over town that Prince William had made an unbelievable decision about it. However, they had remained rumors until William came out to confirm the news. What is this new revelation about Prince Andrew? And what did Prince William do about it? Join us as we reveal the sad news that Prince William confirmed about Prince Andrew. The day, the silence broke. It was an October morning in 2025 when the world woke up to the sound of chaos outside Buckingham Palace. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming as visibly shaken. Royal correspondents repeated the news that Kensington Palace had just confirmed. Prince William had delivered a formal statement regarding his uncle, the Duke of York. For months, there had been whispers of internal meetings and of strained glances between senior royals during official appearances. Despite that, few royal watchers imagined it would come to this. William stood composed behind the podium in the palace briefing room as he prepared to speak. His words were brief, yet carefully chosen and unmistakably final, as he acknowledged the gravity of the moment and referenced the values upon which service to the crown must rest. Then he took a deep sigh and made his announcement to mark the end of any remaining association Prince Andrew had with royal life. Even though the British monarchy had faced controversial tragedies in the past, which often exposed the tension in their lives, the situation surrounding Prince Andrew was different. It wasn't plain old tabloid gossip or some political error. It was something that challenged the very integrity of the institution. The Duke of York's name had been tied to several investigations and settlements that shook the faith of people in the royal family. The incident that stunned people the most was his 2019 BBC interview, which is now infamous for its tone-deaf defense and had already marked the beginning of his fall from grace. In that interview, his words had done what years of rumor could not: convince even his defenders that something was fundamentally broken in his judgment. By early 2020, Andrew had stepped back from official duties, but palace insiders hinted that he never fully accepted it as permanent. He kept trying to restore his image, even though the public had made up its mind about him. And every headline that mentioned his name kept going back to the scandal. All his efforts to move past the controversy only hit brick walls, as people refused to forget. Behind closed doors, the royal family was facing one of the most delicate public relations battles in modern history. After the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, King Charles III had inherited not only the crown, but the weight of repairing trust. His reign had promised a streamlined monarchy focused on service and transparency. That promise became harder to keep as the people's anger toward Andrew continued to simmer. By the time 2025 arrived, analysts had begun to note how the king's approach to modernization seemed hindered by scandals that refused to go away. Polls began to show a wide divide. Nearly 7 out of 10 Britons believed Prince Andrew should never again represent the royal family in any capacity. Even international coverage started to frame the issue as one of moral accountability versus institutional loyalty. It became clear that someone would have to speak, and that someone could only be William. Prince William had long been viewed as the stabilizing force for the monarchy's future. He is practical and deeply aware of the institution's fragile relationship with the people it serves. It was William who understood that the monarchy's survival in the 21st century required moral clarity. When he read that statement in October 2025, it wasn't merely as a nephew delivering bad news. It was as an heir preserving what remained of a centuries-old trust. The announcement may have been clear, but the silence that followed was heavy. Within hours, reporters began piecing together the timeline that had led to this decision. But what exactly was uncovered in that forgotten exchange of emails, and why did it force the royal family to confront its most painful truth after more than a decade of silence? A storm. In the making. The royal announcement in October 2025 didn't arrive out of nowhere. It was the buildup of years of hiding and pretending, and mounting internal pressure that had been building behind the polished facade of the British monarchy. For nearly half a decade, the royal household had been walking a tightrope as they tried to balance compassion for one of their own against the reality of public opinion. By early 2024, insiders described an unmistakable rift forming among senior royals. On one side were those who believed that Andrew had suffered enough. Most of them were traditionalists who claimed that family loyalty should outweigh public relations. On the other side stood a younger faction led by Prince William and Princess Anne, who saw the issue not as a personal matter, but as a constitutional one. They understood that the monarchy's survival depended on moral consistency. To allow Andrew's name to remain tied to royal representation, even symbolically, risked dragging the entire institution into a bad reputation. But decisions within the monarchy are rarely straightforward, and so, for months, there continued to be meetings upon meetings pointing toward one inevitable conclusion. The odds were against His Royal Highness. For King Charles, the situation was profoundly painful. Before he became king, he had always been Andrew's brother. Those two roles had become irreconcilable, and those close to the palace described how Charles continued to maintain contact with Andrew, mostly through private messages and phone calls. He never stopped caring for him as family. But he knew that as king, he had an even bigger duty to the crown, and that duty required distance. But every attempt to finalize Andrew's fate seemed to stall. There was hesitation, perhaps even guilt, until something no one had anticipated surfaced. But what exactly did that 2011 email say? The message that exposed the truth. For years, the monarchy's defenders believed the darkest chapter of Prince Andrew's life was already written. The BBC interview in 2019 had been humiliating, and the legal settlement had been costly. Many assumed that, with time, the story would fade, and that whatever was left of his reputation might heal. But in October 2025, an old message surfaced. It was short, yet it carried a devastating implication that reopened wounds the palace had spent years trying to close. It was a single email, dated 28 February 2011, sent from Prince Andrew's account to Jeffrey Epstein's. The contents, confirmed by metadata and authenticated by independent digital forensics experts, were simple. But they were enough to ruin Andrew's reputation. Among the most cited lines were, "We are in this together," and "Let's play some more soon." To the casual observer, it may seem like nothing more than a friendly message, but context changes everything. Well, just a day before this email was written, the now famous photograph of Prince Andrew standing beside Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell had come up in global media. That image of the Duke of York with his arm around a teenage girl, who would later accuse him of sexual abuse, had already become one of the most controversial royal photos of the modern era. The problem was that in his 2019 BBC Newsnight interview, Andrew had declared that he had stopped all contact with Jeffrey Epstein in 2010. He even went further, describing their final meeting as a gesture of closure, insisting that any relationship had ended well before the public fallout. But the simple existence of that 2011 email completely contradicted that claim. Before legal correspondents released the email message to journalists, it was first sent to forensic analysts. The forensic analysis confirmed the message was sent from an official palace-linked domain, with routing signatures matching Andrew's correspondence network at the time. It couldn't have been forged. It was time-stamped and verifiable. Just that made it matter greatly. The timing added greater depth to the situation. The message was sent not merely after the alleged cutoff date, but also in the days when Epstein was already a convicted sex offender. Public opinion at that time expected any association with him to be unthinkable for a royal, and so the release set off what insiders call a struggle to contain the fallout. Within hours, several emergency meetings had been held to assess the situation, while the Royal Communications Office remained silent, without issuing any immediate statement. A silence that only deepened speculation. Investigators, journalists, and historians drew a brutal conclusion. Prince Andrew had misled the public during one of the most scrutinized royal interviews in modern British history. Every quote from that BBC interview was suddenly re-evaluated. When he said he didn't regret his friendship with Epstein because it offered him useful connections, his tone seemed naive. Now, with the email in context, it felt manipulative. But one fact became unmissable. If this email had been accessible all along, how had it never surfaced sooner? Had it been overlooked, or had it been intentionally buried? Well, some insiders hinted that the message had been flagged years earlier in private legal reviews, but then it was considered irrelevant. Others suggested that its rediscovery was the result of a broader digital transparency effort, initiated under William's direction as a part of a modernization drive within royal record-keeping. Whatever the source, the implications were the same, and of all the scandals the monarchy has ever faced, it finally encountered the first technological reckoning. But to understand the weight of what this discovery destroyed, one must first remember that before the scandal, there was a prince once adored and loved. So who was Prince Andrew before the fall? And how did that image collapse so completely? The man before the storm. Before the controversies and the exile, there was a man who was loved by everyone. The Queen's second son, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, had long been seen as the confident and capable face of the monarchy's new generation. Andrew's early life as a prince was full of tradition and ceremony. But as he grew older, his image began to take shape in uniforms. Andrew's years in the Royal Navy remain one of the proudest chapters of his life. He served as a helicopter pilot during the Falklands War in 1982, flying dangerous missions under enemy fire. It was a moment that redefined his role in the eyes of the British public. For a time, he was not just the Queen's son, but a man who had faced danger. In newspapers and documentaries from that era, he was portrayed as a fearless and charismatic man, and that reputation carried him far beyond military service. By the late 1990s, Andrew had become one of the monarchy's key international representatives, promoting British trade and industry abroad. His title as the Special Representative for International Trade and Investment gave him influence across boardrooms. World leaders and business magnates often described him as persuasive and impeccably connected. It was a time when his presence at summits or diplomatic dinners signified the prestige of the crown itself. Yet prestige in his case came with proximity to power. And power, as history often shows, invites scrutiny. Those close to the palace recall a man who began to believe in his own invincibility, one whose confidence sometimes blurred into arrogance. Reports from aides and civil servants later described him as difficult and increasingly detached from the constraints of protocol. The discipline that defined his naval years seemed to fade into the indulgence of royal privilege. His personal relationships added another layer to his complex image. His marriage to Sarah Ferguson in 1986 was, in fact, one of the decade's most public royal spectacles. Millions watched as the young, energetic couple waved from the Buckingham Palace balcony, seemingly in love and full of promise. The Duke and Duchess of York quickly became the public's favorites. Their daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, would later speak warmly of their father's protective nature and his devotion as a parent. But soon cracks began to appear, and by 1996, the marriage had collapsed. Over time, his talks about his spending and his attitude grew louder. His network became increasingly filled with wealthy businessmen and social elites whose reputations were not always clean. As trade envoy, he often traveled with private interests rather than official delegations, prompting journalists to question whether he truly served the crown or himself. And yet, through all of this, Andrew still enjoyed a degree of protection no ordinary public figure could expect. His status as the Queen's son meant that consequences came slowly, if at all. The monarchy's instinct was to preserve, not expose. Inside the institution, senior advisors tried to shield him from mounting criticism. But behind closed doors, the mood was shifting. There were concerns, not yet public, about the company he kept, about dinners and introductions that seemed too casual for a man of his position. For years, these remained internal worries, sealed within palace walls. When history looks back at this period, it will see a man unaware of how close he was to losing everything. Andrew's reputation had carried him far, perhaps farther than merit alone could take him. But reputation, like trust, is fragile. It takes decades to build, and one revelation to destroy. But how did Andrew find himself with a man whose image would destroy his own image? The connection that unrivaled everything. For years, the connection existed in silence, spoken of in coded terms by journalists and barely acknowledged by the palace. But when the truth began to unfold, it became impossible to contain. The name Jeffrey Epstein no longer belonged to the private corridors of power. It was now a scandal that stretched across oceans, implicating some of the world's most influential figures. And at the heart of Britain's own royal institution, one name appeared again and again: Prince Andrew. The friendship between Andrew and Epstein began in the late 1990s, introduced through Ghislaine Maxwell, a woman deeply embedded in both high society and Epstein's social network. At the time, Epstein was known publicly as a financier with connections to the elite, yet his private life still remained luxurious and secretive. To Andrew, he represented a combination of wealth and influence, precisely the kind of company that had long surrounded the Duke. They attended parties together, shared mutual friends, and were photographed in several cities. What was seen then as mere association would later become evidence of judgment that is terribly misplaced. In the early 2000s, Epstein's reputation began to fracture. Allegations of misconduct were whispered but not yet proven. For most, these were rumors. For Andrew, they were apparently discretion reasons, not distance. Even after Epstein's first arrest in 2006 on charges of sexual offenses involving minors, Andrew did not sever ties completely. Officially, the palace described it as a misjudgment. Unofficially, insiders admitted that the Duke underestimated the gravity of the situation, or perhaps believed his position would shield him from its consequences. By 2010, Andrew was photographed walking with Epstein in New York's Central Park, shortly after Epstein had been released from his first prison term. The image circulated across the world, igniting outrage. For the British public, it wasn't just the act of friendship that shocked them. It was the indifference it seemed to represent. Here was a senior royal, already cushioned by privilege, appearing to disregard the moral boundaries that others in public life would never cross. The situation escalated in 2015 when court documents in the United States mentioned Andrew's name in connection to Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most vocal accusers. Though he consistently denied the allegations, insisting he had no recollection of meeting her, the damage was already done. The photograph of them together, him with his arm around her waist, Ghislaine Maxwell smiling in the background, became one of the most scrutinized images in modern royal history. Forensic experts, journalists, and online investigators debated its authenticity for years. To this day, it stands as a haunting visual symbol of the scandal that redefined his life. The palace's public response was defensive but controlled. Statements were carefully worded, emphasizing both Andrew's denial and his cooperation with authorities. But behind closed doors, the tone was different. Advisors were alarmed by his refusal to show remorse or understanding of public sentiment. One senior courtier later told reporters anonymously that he thought the institution could absorb the hit, but it couldn't. The monarchy, already tested by generational change, could not afford another crisis tied to its inner circle. When Epstein was found dead in his cell in 2019, the story did not end. It intensified. Questions about accountability, complicity, and truth resurfaced, this time with a force that reached across governments and media empires. For Andrew, it marked the moment when his public life became unsalvageable. Every photograph, every itinerary, every friendship of the past 2 decades was re-examined. His 2019 BBC interview, intended to clear his name, instead deepened the crisis. Analysts described it as the interview that ended a career. The tone was detached, the answers defensive, and the public reaction unforgiving. For many viewers, it wasn't just disbelief they felt, it was disillusionment. In 2022, when Virginia Giuffre's civil case was settled out of court, the palace sought to distance itself even further. Official statements emphasized that no admission of guilt was made, but public opinion had long solidified. The British people, once willing to separate private mistakes from public duty, could no longer draw that line. Polls showed that a majority believed Andrew should permanently withdraw from royal duties. And so, gradually, he did. His military titles were returned to the crown. His patronages were stripped. His office at Buckingham Palace was closed. What remained was silence and a name forever changed. Then, in early 2024, a devastating development emerged. Virginia Giuffre, whose accusations had shaped much of the public narrative, passed away. She was said to have taken her own life, and though the palace did not comment, the event cast a long shadow over the story. It reminded the public that behind every scandal are human costs that can't be paid off. Her death reignited discussions of justice and accountability, not in the courts, but in the collective conscience of a society still grappling with how much power excuses and how much truth demands. By October 2025, the newly revealed 2011 email resurfaced in public debate, serving as a haunting reminder of the contradictions that had defined Andrew's defense. Investigators described it as the missing piece that undermined years of denial. And as that detail came to light, it wasn't just his integrity under question, it was the credibility of the institution itself. Prince Andrew's story had become something far larger than one man's fall from grace. It was now a case study in what happens when accountability meets entitlement, when the private failings of a royal become the moral test of a monarchy. His past heroism, his rank, and his lineage could no longer protect him. The man who once stood in uniform under his mother's flag now found himself standing alone, not as a symbol of service, but as a lesson in consequence. But with this scandal, would the monarchy be able to survive the silence that followed it? The cost of honor and the weight of silence. The monarchy has survived wars, divorces, and even deaths. It has endured scandal after scandal, adapting to each generation's scrutiny with restraint. But what unfolded within its walls after the Andrew revelations was something far more personal. The year 2025 marked not just the exposure of an old lie, but the moment Britain's most private family was forced to confront what loyalty means when truth is no longer optional. In the months following the resurfaced 2011 email, the usual rhythm of royal engagements continued. However, an unease continued to stick around. The Duke of York's name was removed from official communications entirely. His crest, once carved into invitations and embroidered on ceremonial fabrics, had also vanished. For the first time in modern royal history, a senior member of the family had not merely stepped back, but been institutionally erased. Those who worked within the royal household described it as a kind of mourning that came without death. For King Charles, the decision to formalize Andrew's removal from all royal representation required not just his signature, but his acceptance that the monarchy's moral authority outweighed a father's instinct to protect. He was said to have reviewed the final draft of the statement several times before passing it on. A sign, perhaps, of both hesitation and inevitability. But the final approval did not come from the king alone. Within the modern hierarchy of the crown, Prince William was now in charge of its future. It was clear that the ultimate responsibility for managing the fallout rested on his shoulders. The announcement was brief. It acknowledged a matter concluded in accordance with the principles of integrity and duty. There were no direct mentions of Andrew and no reference to the email, yet the meaning was unmistakable. The Duke of York's remaining ceremonial ties were permanently withdrawn. His role within the family was reduced to that of a private citizen. In the space of a few sentences, a chapter of royal history quietly closed. William's announcement was brief, but behind that statement was a reality no press release could capture. Insiders described the decision as the hardest moment of William's public life. For a man raised to preserve the monarchy's dignity, the idea of publicly distancing his uncle, his father's brother, represented a kind of sacrifice not often acknowledged in royal language. William's approach had always been guided by his mother's principle that public service should never depend on privilege. But even for him, the weight of this particular duty was crushing. Within the family itself, the ripples were profound. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie maintained their loyalty to their father, retreating from public appearances. Queen Camilla, ever the pragmatist, was said to have supported William's resolve, reminding him that monarchy is not sentiment. King Charles, meanwhile, carried the visible strain of a decision that had divided his bloodline. Andrew himself remained at the huge royal lodge, rarely appearing in public. Occasionally he was seen driving through Windsor Great Park, alone, sometimes stopping to watch the planes overhead from the nearby Heathrow. For all the wealth and property that remained, what he no longer possessed was a role, and in a family where existence was defined by duty, that absence felt like exile. In the days following the announcement, public discussion moved quickly. Newspapers filled their pages with commentary about a new royal standard. But behind the headlines was the reality of a family that had finally turned its gaze inward. For the first time, accountability had been applied not as an act of image management, but as a test of moral conviction. Hopefully, this scandal, like many in the past, would fade away. But by then, what version of it would emerge? Because in the long story of Britain's crown, moments like these do not destroy it, they redefine it. And perhaps that was the truest lesson of all, that even within the oldest institution on earth, the hardest reckonings are not fought in public, they unfold in the rooms where conscience and power finally meet. What do you think about Andrew's position in the Epstein case? Do you think Prince William's decision was the right step to take? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.